To your mind when you hear the term the religious right? Do you think about issues such as opposition to women and girls having the freedom to decide whether to obtain abortions? Do you think about opposition to equality for persons who are LGBTQ? Do you think about prayer or support for prayer in public schools? Do you think about one major political party or another? Do you think about the words of Jesus we read about in Matthew 25, 31 to 46? Matthew 25, 31 to 46 follows several passages where Jesus taught in parables. At Matthew 21, beginning in verses 28 through 32, we read about the parable of two sons. Then there's the parable of the wicked tenants at Matthew 21, 33 through 46. Then the parable of the wedding feast, Matthew 22, 1 through 14. Who can forget the parable of the wise and the foolish bridesmaids? 5 wise, 5 foolish, Matthew 25, 1 through 13. And then the parable of the talents. You recall the parable of talents? Also called the parable of the hard taskmaster, hard master, Matthew 25, 14 to 30. However, the lesson we ponder today is not a parable. It is not a parable. Instead, it is the only detailed description of what people call the final judgment found in the New Testament. It is the only one. And guess what? It's declared by Jesus. You would think he would have some idea of what's going on. It is the last teaching delivered by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew before we read about his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, his death, his resurrection. And in this lesson, Jesus revealed and declared that he would eventually be revealed, quote, in his glory and all the angels with him as judge and king over all the peoples of the world. Term all nations. And Jesus described a process in which he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. A common practice of shepherds every night in Palestine at that time. Flocks of sheep and goats were herded together. At nighttime, the shepherds would separate the sheep from the goats. And so in this description, Jesus uses 3 words to describe himself. Final judge, final king, final shepherd. You know the story. Some people, the sheep, be separated on the right hand of the judge and the king. Other people, the goats, be separated on the left hand of the judge and the king. Now, they're not really sheep and goats. Remember, he said, as a shepherd separates sheep and goats. So don't call people sheep and don't call people goats, okay? Because I've heard people say, you goats. Well, no. Jesus was simply using the term sheep and goats to describe how shepherds separated the flock at nighttime and to describe this process as the same way that he in the final judgment would separate all people. All of the people are one flock. Here's the imagery. All humanity is one flock, one shepherd, and one shepherd separating the whole flock the way shepherds of that time separated sheep and goats. Okay, you got it. You got it now. This is how Jesus described the final judgment. You know the story. Those on the right hand will be welcomed to everlasting fellowship with the king and judge. Those on the left hand will be condemned to everlasting punishment by the king and judge. And that is how Jesus described the final judgment. For all humanity, for all humanity. Welcome to how Jesus defined the religious right. Welcome to how Jesus defined it. According to this lesson, the religious right is not associated with any government. It's not affiliated with any political party or movement. It's not a faction or a fiction of one period of history or another. The religious right is not even associated with a specific religious movement. The religious right doesn't even seem to be Christian. Doesn't seem to be Jewish. Doesn't seem to be associated with any theology, any creed, any denomination, any doctrinal position. Notice that Jesus mentioned none of the stuff that we typically associate with the term religious right when he said right and left. What Jesus did was describe a final judgment in which all humanity is assigned, that he assigns to his right will be directed there by the following unforgettable standard. Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world, for I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to eat, to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. And Jesus described a final judgment in which all humanity directed to his left will be directed there by the following unforgettable standard we read about. You that are cursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels, for I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not welcome me. That unforgettable standard, according to Jesus, will determine the ultimate fate of every soul in every period of time. It challenges us because nowhere do we read, well, come those of you who made perfect attendance in Sunday school. Come those of you who were the biggest tithers. Come those of you who had the best church record attendance. Jesus declared that even the people on the right and the left would be perplexed about why they got there. When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison? And then we come to these words. Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to the least, to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. Jesus declared that how we treat people who are marginalized, unprivileged, unpopular, weak, frail, outcast is the defining evidence of our religion and is the ultimate predictor of our standing with God. And all of a sudden, that sort of pulls us up short, doesn't it? Because all of a sudden, that cuts across a whole lot of stuff that we use to say who's right. Jesus declared that justice and compassion are the defining standards for whether we truly hunger and thirst after righteousness. And Jesus made the objects of justice and compassion people who are hungry, people who are thirsty, people who are naked. Translate naked, homeless. People who are sick, people who are frail, people who are incarcerated, people who are in prison. Jesus called them the least of these, and he called them my family. My family. And that declaration from Jesus, now remember now, it may not be that I have a genuine Bible. I may have a bootleg Bible. But all of my bootleg copies have this passage in it. Okay? Every one of my bootleg copies has this in it. It has it in my King James Version, in my NIV, in my NRSV, in my New King James Version, in my Living Bible, in my Message Bible, every one of them. So all of them are bootlegged. And according to every one of them, the religious right of the people who are taking care of the people who Jesus called the least of these. And that forces me, it forces you, it forces us to take a hard look at what we call the religious right in every religion, because every religion has what it calls a religious right. Every religion has folks who call themselves and are perceived by others as the exemplars, the models of the faith. According to Jesus, the religious right won't be limited to people called Christians. Don't read anything about, come to me, those of you who are Christians. Don't read anything about, depart from me, those of you who are not Christians. Sort of messes with us, doesn't it? Sort of messes with us, doesn't it? All of a sudden, that sort of makes us have to read and look at the whole writings of Paul. Hello? You recall? All of a sudden, we have to rethink everything we've read about Paul's theology and think about that. Okay, now. According to Jesus, the religious right doesn't even include folks we call evangelical Christians, because, we say, we are called to go into all the world and make disciples, but Jesus doesn't say the religious right of the people who go into the world and make disciples. Is Jesus confused? To quote the young folks, has Jesus got it twisted? How can Jesus make, on the only passage he does about the final judgment, how can he miss so much that we major so much in? Surely Jesus has to understand the imperative of global missions. Surely Jesus has to understand the imperative of doctrinal integrity. Surely Jesus has to understand the importance of getting it right, dotting the I's and crossing the T's of doctrine. What's wrong with Jesus? Ponder that thought. According to Jesus, the religious right will not be limited to people who are openly associated with any religious label. Oh my goodness gracious. You mean all this worry we've been doing about Protestants and Catholics? Christians and Jews and Muslims? You mean all of the battles we've fought? You mean all of that doesn't have anything to do with the final judgment? No. The standard declared by Jesus can be met by people who are religiously affiliated and by people who are not affiliated with any religion. Ponder that thought. What is wrong with Jesus? According to Jesus, the religious right is not about opposition to this or that, whether it's freedom to obtain abortions or prayer in public schools or opposition to LGBTQ equality or proselytizing the world. Oh, ponder that thought. You mean all of the effort we are using and all the arguments we're having about those issues has nothing to do with the final judgment? I read it, and I read it, and I read it, and I couldn't find it. And the reason why I am talking about this is because Matthew 25:31 through 46 cannot be ignored. We are stuck with, and we are struck by the words of Jesus. Jesus did not talk about praying, preaching, evangelizing, singing, and any of the other stuff we spend a whole lot of time talking about in deciding who's right. Jesus talked about justice and compassion for suffering people, for vulnerable people, for marginalized people, for immigrant people, for incarcerated people. And Jesus called those people my family. And Jesus had the audacity, the unmitigated gall to promise to bless or to curse us based on how we treat his brothers and sisters who are hungry, thirsty, homeless, sick, immigrant, and incarcerated. I may have a bootleg copy of the Bible, but all my bootleg copies have Jesus saying that. So given what Jesus plainly declared, it's saddening to see how so many religious people reject his standard in favor of something else in order to be declared right. How quickly we run to stuff that Jesus didn't talk about in order for us to call ourselves right. It's saddening to see people who call ourselves followers of Jesus, the one who embraced immigrants as family, turn around and cheer and embrace people who castigate immigrants and turn immigrants away. It's saddening to see people who call themselves lovers of God and followers of Jesus cheer and embrace calls to treat people who are hungry, who are sick, who are thirsty, who are homeless, who are in prisons as burdens on our society, who are burdens on us, burdens on our hearts, as rather than neighbors and family members we are to embrace and care for. It's saddening to see how so many of us are so easily perceived and deceived, persuaded and dissuaded, misled by notions of pride, personal pride, cultural pride, ethnic pride, national pride, religious pride, that we forget that Jesus did not define any of that as right. It's saddening to see how people are willing to forget or simply disregard that Jesus declared that people who are hungry and thirsty and homeless and sick and immigrants and incarcerated are his surrogates in the world. They are his representatives. They are the people who are the people that Jesus looks to decide how to deal with us. Lord, when did we see you thirsty? And then you want to ask for themselves, do I see the Native Americans who are protesting the threat posed by oil pipelines to their water as surrogates of Jesus? Do I see African Americans in Flint, Michigan who are drinking bottled water for the last 3 years because their water supply has been contaminated by people who were more interested in profit than in the health of the neighborhood as surrogates of Jesus? Do we see Palestinians whose land has been occupied, whose water rights have been taken, whose homes have been destroyed by agents of Zionism, supported by our nation and other nations as surrogates of Jesus? Or do we just see them as an outgrowth of our politics? Lord, when did we see you naked? Our sisters and brothers in Puerto Rico are not invisible. We know where they are. We know that 2 months ago, Hurricane Maria struck. We know that Hurricane Maria knocked out their infrastructure. We know they're suffering from the effects of no power, water supplies compromised. Are we responding to them as if they are agents of Jesus? Or are they simply another reason for us to say, gosh, that's too much trouble? Lord, when did we see you in prison? Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Are we treating incarcerated people the way we would treat Jesus? Will we really charge Jesus the same rates for phone calls if he was in prison as we charge the people who are in our jails and lockups? Do we even bother to ask ourselves whether we would imprison Jesus the way we hold people in prison? Would we send Jesus to jail and prison if Jesus had a drug addiction? Lord, when did we see you? You see, the when did we see you questions and the answers of Jesus challenge us to rethink the whole meaning of right and the whole meaning of religion, and therefore the whole meaning of religious right. These questions compel us to realize that the religion of Jesus is the religion of justice and compassion for everyone, especially those who, in the words of Howard Thurman, live with their backs against the wall. And the kingdom Jesus promised to rule is a kingdom of justice and compassion, where those we think of as least are the standard by which the rest of us will be judged. And this teaching contradicts every notion of religious and national and commercial and cultural and personal empire. It is consistent with the commandment that we love our neighbors as ourselves, and requires us to acknowledge that we consider those who are least are really our equals. Those who Jesus called the least of these in my family are our equals and therefore our neighbors. And when God says through Jesus, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, then we do not love God if we love not the hungry, if we love not the thirsty, if we love not the homeless, if we love not the sick, the imprisoned. In the final analysis, Jesus will decide who makes up the religious right by referring to whether we do right by people he called the least of those who are members of my family. And therefore, that means that you and I need to be wise enough to reassess what we mean by the religious right. Are we using the standard Jesus used? And if we're not, what Bible do we find the standard that we're using in? I may have a bootleg Bible, but the only standard I have is in my bootleg copies. What standard are we using? When we use the standard Jesus used, we're likely to conclude that the religious right we think about do not behave like the people Jesus promised to assign places on his right. Ponder that thought. It appears that Jesus has already done so. Guess what? Jesus is not going to change his mind. Amen.